After studying this module, you would be able to understand the concept of the structural adjustment program of IMF and World Bank. To analyze the impact of the structural adjustment program on economic development and to comprehend the influence of the economic environment on the structural adjustment policies. The SAP, as it is popularly called, has been developed for developing countries that have been promoted by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, since the early 80s. This is towards the objective of these international bodies who provide the loans and other means of financing economic development in the developing economies. So, these international bodies expected that the developing countries would adopt those policies, such policies which would be in keeping with the objectives of World Bank and IMF. Hence, these are known as the conditionalities of the World Bank and IMF. The loans are designed to encourage the structural adjustment of the economy by removing excessive government controls and by promoting market competition as a part of the neoliberal agenda followed by the World Bank and IMF. The Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facility is an IMF financing mechanism to support macroeconomic policies in developing economies. SAP's policies reflect the neoliberal ideology that drives globalization and liberalization. The aim of these policies is the long-term accelerated economic growth in developing countries by restructuring the economy and reducing government intervention. SAP policies include currency devaluation, managed balance of payments, reduction in government services through public spending cuts and budget deficit cuts, reduction in taxes on higher earners, reduction of inflation, wages, suppression of such inflationary tendencies, privatization, lower tariffs on imports and a tighter monetary policy and increased free trade and cuts in social spending and also the removal of business regulations in the country. In these countries, governments are also encouraged to force and are forced to reduce their role in the economy by privatizing the state-owned industries, including sectors like health and opening up their economies to foreign competitions. Why was SAP needed actually? Well, SAP policies are implemented depending upon the economic problems such as high inflation, severe indebtedness, lack of competitiveness in the world economy and so on. Some of these problems are a result of wrong government policies, corruption and poor oversight of projects in the economy. A country may have to restructure its economic policies to streamline the economy, to decrease inefficiency and waste and to provide a stable economy that would lead to sustained economic growth. The World Bank and IMF made structural adjustment measures a crucial component of the package of loans and advances that they used to give for the developing and the struggling economies. However, the types of structural adjustment mechanisms that the bank and the fund prescribed often fail to promote the sustainable economies, and instead they led to increased income inequality and poverty. Often it led to social disruption and environmental degradation. What are the structural adjustment measures that the IMF and the World Bank have promoted? The two international bodies, in light of the neoliberal free market economic policies, recommended things like trade and investment liberalization, exchange rate liberalization, privatization, a decrease in the role of state, and deregulation of the major sectors of the economy, as well as changes in the market and society relating to labor employment, to the business, and to the environment. The tools that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank utilized included export promotion schemes such as subsidies to export industries, the dismantling of trade and the investment regulation, devaluing the currency and cutting government budget and slashing the government programs, and on the other hand privatizing major sectors of the state and handing them over to the private sector. This process was known as disinvestment. The SAP policies opened up the developing economies to competition from large and often subsidized multinationals, making the rich countries from the north even more rich and often leading to an impoverishment and bankruptcy in the developing countries, particularly in the small businesses and amongst the working population. The bank and IMF do not promote adjustment measures that might directly target income inequality and poverty, or even environmental protection. Such a credit to the poor or the green taxes and environmental accounting, these are some areas which are not touched by the SAP adjustment program. The structural adjustment policies emerged from the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and World Bank. They emerged and they are called as the conditionality that the IMF and the World Bank have been attaching to their loans since the 1950s. Initially, these conditions focused on the country's macroeconomic policies. From 1950s onwards, the United States gave loans and other forms of financial aid to the third world countries, now commonly referred to as the least developed countries, in part to promote the economic tenets of neoliberalism known as the Washington Consensus. The free market economics was encouraged in the third world, not only to measure the countering of the spread, not only as a measure to countering the spread of the socialist ideology during the Cold War, but also as a means of fostering foreign direct investment and promoting the access of foreign companies within the OECD nations to certain sectors of the target economies. In particular, the Western companies sought to gain access to the extraction of raw commodities, raw materials, especially minerals and agricultural products, where loans were negotiated on the basis of implementing large infrastructural projects such as roads and electricity, dams and power grids and so on. The Western countries stood to gain by employing their domestic businesses and by broadening the means by which the Western companies would extract these resources to their advantage. Loans made under the structural adjustment program came with certain conditions, and these were recommended by the top economists of the IMF and the World Bank. After the decline of the US dollar in 1979-80, the US itself was facing a severe monetary crunch, and therefore the monetary policies and institutions had to aggressively promote the capital which was flowing out of the US on a global scale. This was a successful program which resulted in the current account of the country's balance of payments. Enormous capital flows to the United States and the corollary of dramatically depleting the available capital of the poor and middling countries happened at this time. It has been observed that this scarcity of capital, which was heralded by the Mexican debt crisis of 1982, created a propitious environment for the counter-revolution in development thought and practice, and the neoliberal Washington Consensus began advocating about the structural adjustment program, which was a consequence of the Washington Consensus. Taking advantage of the financial straits of many low and middle income countries, the agencies, that is the IMF and the World Bank, had a consensus, and this consensus was forced on the developing countries in the form of the structural adjustment program. They did nothing to improve the position that is of the developing countries in the global hierarchy, but actually greatly facilitated the redirection of capital flows towards sustaining the revival of US and such other wealthy and powerful economies. During the 80s, the IMF and the World Bank created a loans package for the majority of the countries in the sub-Saharan Africa as they experienced an economic crisis. To this day, economists can point out to few, if any, examples of substantial economic growth amongst the LDCs under the SAP. Moreover, very few loans have been paid off. Pressure mounts on these countries to forgive their debts, some of which is demand substantially proportion of the government expenditure to service. Structural adjustment policies originated due to a series of global economic disasters in the late 70s. The oil crisis, the debt crisis, multiple economic depression and stagflation, all of these have been reasons which ultimately led to the structural adjustment program. These fiscal disasters led to policymakers to decide that deeper the intervention, it was necessary to improve the country's overall well-being. Well, the main focus of SAP has continued to be the balancing of external debts and trade deficits. The reason for those debts has undergone a transition. Today, SAP has their lending institution and their lending institutions have increased their sphere of influence by providing relief to countries experiencing economic problems due to natural disaster or due to economic mismanagement. Since its inception, SAP has been adopted by a number of other international financial institutions and countries. How do these structural adjustment measures harm the environment? Structural adjustment program contributes to degrading the environment through its main emphasis on promoting exports, including especially the agricultural exports and natural resource exports, minerals, as well as through its undermining the enforcement of the environmental regulation. One of the major goals of structural adjustment policies is to generate the foreign exchange through a positive trade balance to meet IMF's ambitious targets for currency reserves, trade balance, and currencies. The countries must quickly generate the foreign exchange, often turning to their own natural resource base. Countries often overexploit their natural resources through unsustainable forestry, mining, and agricultural practices that generate pollution and lead to environmental degradation. Therefore, there is a choice between having a stable balance of payments and, on the other hand, exploiting or over exploiting nature. Export of natural resources has increased at an astonishing rate in many countries under the IMF's adjustment program, with which no consideration for environmental sustainability was given in this program. Furthermore, the IMF policies often promote price sensitive raw material export rather than finished products. Finished products would capture more value added and would employ people in different enterprises, would diversify the economy and disseminate more of technology and know-how. So all of this would actually go towards the benefit of developing economies, and this way probably they would be able to do both. They would be able to sustain their environment, and at the same time they would be able to have economic development without having to pay the cost either in terms of balance of payments or in terms of the environment. So now let us look at trade liberalization and export promotion. The kind of structural adjustment program that the IMF fund style requires countries to quickly dismantle any trade barriers and become active players in the world economy. However, poor, newly emerging developing economies find it difficult, if not impossible, to compete in the world market. Large multinationals find it easy to enter into developing countries and take over the economic sector there, exploiting the country's natural resource base for the benefit of the multinationals and consequently polluting the host country in terms of its environment. That means that these polluting industries are transferred from the home country, from the rich countries to the poor countries, and the consequences are very harmful for the natural environment of these developing and poor economies. Furthermore, to boost the competitiveness of the export sector with the aim of earning foreign exchange, the IMF and World Bank loans can be repaid through export industries, and companies often receive subsidies and preferential treatment. Many of these subsidies actually lead to greater environmental problems. For example, agricultural exports, if they receive subsidies for pesticides, leading to a greater use of pesticides, it would actually pollute the soil as well as the environment and the water bodies of these developing economies. Such negative effects on the environment actually lead also to excessive use of energy as well as water. In terms of exchange rate devaluation, the typical requirement of developing countries is to devalue their currency in order to make the prices cheaper and to boost the country's competitiveness in the world market. However, devaluation is something which does not automatically lead to better balance of payments. We all know that there is something known as the Marshall-Lerner condition. The Marshall-Lerner condition states that the elasticity of exports plus the elasticity of imports should be greater than 1. And if this doesn't happen, a devaluation will actually worsen the balance of payments problem in these developing countries. So, as such, this is not really a permanent solution. Moreover, devaluation has an implication in terms of reduced terms of trade. That means the terms of trade become unfavorable for the developing countries. So, once again there is a choice between having an overvalued currency and having balance of payments deficits, and on the other hand having a undervalued currency or a normal currency, and at the same time still continuing with the balance of payments deficit, and also facing terms of trade which become adverse. So, therefore, these are some of the problems that the structural adjustment program means to the developing economies. Governments are asked to cut down on their budget. The structural adjustment program virtually always requires that developing countries should reduce the state expenditure, and it becomes a very difficult balancing exercise for the governments because the needs of developing economies never reduce. The social problems do not reduce, they go on increasing. Poverty, unemployment, health, education, all of these things need more and more of government expenditure. So, if government expenditure is cut down and the presence of government is cut down, then the revenues would also be cut down, then it becomes a very difficult problem for the government to balance their budget, and this leads to all kinds of problems such as deforestation, pollution, and illegal dumping of pollutants and so on. And this also, when the government control reduces, then one of the implications is that the control on the pollution laws also reduce, and therefore this gives an opportunity for the Western countries, the developed countries, to relocate their industries, and this is one outcome which perhaps was not thought of by the IMF and the World Bank. The shrinking government budget also indirectly leads to all kinds of inequalities in terms of income inequalities and unemployment and so on. So, these are all some of the very deleterious effects of the structural adjustment program. Now, let us consider privatization. In some cases, privatization has led to increased efficiency, while in some other cases, privatization has actually led to a greater use of water, energy, and lower output in certain cases, because sometimes the choice is between profitability and total output. A social objective always prefers total output. However, privatization often occurs within a large scale dismantling of the role of state. So, privatization goes along with disinvestment of the state sector. With the disinvestment of the state sector, one of the implications is that the state sector, public enterprises, are often having certain social objectives. So, those social objectives are bound to suffer when we have disinvestment of the state sector. Privatization often means the state loses its ability to make and enforce laws. It also loses revenue. Let us not forget that privatization and the dismantling of the state mechanism would also lead to a reduction in revenue. So, the structural adjustment program would very often actually lead to anomalous results such as poverty, unsustainable economies, environmental degradation. However, structural adjustment program in parts would also promote efficiency and strengthens the economy. It makes the businesses, industry and the economy in general more conscious towards being efficient and reducing wasteful expenditure. There are several measures that the structural adjustment program provides for improvement of efficiency. This includes training the developing country officials in national income accounting and also things like green taxes, carbon credits and so on, to provide credit to the poorest of poor sections of society, particularly through things like microfinance to women who lack funds for carrying out their ordinary day-to-day business activities, and to attempt to remove people from the vicious cycle of poverty. It allows countries to retain subsidies for socially and environmentally beneficial goods so that the value of such products is recognized. It allows countries to tax and impose import tariffs on socially and environmentally harmful goods so that the social and environmental costs could be incorporated into the pricing of such commodities. It strongly urges and encourages the government to preserve or increase spending for social and environmental programs. At a minimum, it insists that the government should reduce the level of expenditure that goes towards unnecessary expenditure. So, the criticism of the SAP is in terms of certain aspects. National sovereignty. This is very important because the developing countries are have recently become independent. So, it is important that they have some freedom in terms of their own national sovereignty. If the governments of developing countries have to always look up to the World Bank and the IMF, and for each of their policies, if they are to be guided by the World Bank and IMF, then this compromises their national sovereignty. Privatization. This is another aspect which needs to be looked at critically. Privatization implies a disinvestment and the sale of the property belonging to the state-owned enterprises. Very often what happens is the aim of this policy measure is to improve efficiency because it is assumed that the private owners would be more efficient. However, very often what happens is that the decision to disinvest the public sector undertakings, public sector units is often faulty because the assets are offered at a very low price, and therefore there is an undue advantage which goes to the private owners who take over the state enterprises. And this also means a loss to the exchequer, and therefore in turn what it means is that the deficit of the government, instead of decreasing, actually increases. So, this is one of the. Then about austerity, that it is ostensibly meant, SAP is ostensibly meant for austerity, that is for conserving resources in the government budget and programs, but actually what happens is that the cuts are often directed towards the most vulnerable sections of society, that is public health, education, primary education and social safety net and so on. So, there is an anomalous effect of austerity in terms of the health of the economy, the social conditions in the economy. So, these are some of the very severe effects that have often led to all kinds of anomalous situations, disease, poverty, unemployment, social unrest, and so on. Recent studies have shown that there is a strong connection between SAP and, you would not imagine, tuberculosis rates in developing economies, because these are some of the critical areas in the developing economies which suffer because of the structural adjustment program. Countries with native populations living in traditional lifestyles face a unique challenge in regard to the structural adjustment program. The rural and urban scales needs are different, and the factors that need to go towards rural urban development are different, and all of these are treated only with one yardstick when it comes to the structural adjustment program. So, this again creates all kinds of anomalies within the development of developing economies, as I have said, in terms of the environment, in terms of the problems like poverty, health, and even some distant issues like we have stated about tuberculosis being affected severely due to the structural adjustment program. There is more research on how the structural adjustment program has been leading to all kinds of other problems in the case of developing economies. So, the choice is very difficult for developing economies. Should they go for the structural adjustment program and face other problems, or should they not go for the structural adjustment program and face problems in terms of basic conditions like balance of payments, debt, etc. So, these are very serious questions which have to be considered. In the light of this, we would now like to sum up and see what we have been studying in this module. The new growing structural adjustment program has led to structural changes in the economy. Sometimes it has led to a decline in agricultural employment. It favors non-agricultural employment, especially this has been happening in the case of India. However, the new form of structural change is stunted because of one of its primary aims not being met, that is to generate employment. It creates a problem in the informal sector. It creates insecurity. Without the benefits of health and employment, even such other measures like insurance and pensions would be not of great use. In spite of the rapid growth in the Indian economy, the structural adjustment program has been constrained by the weakness of employment growth overall and even within the urban economy. The dream of a service economy with secure jobs has not been realized because privatization means that there is no secure future as far as the employees are concerned. Therefore, in a nutshell, the choice of the structural adjustment program is, to put it somewhat brazenly, is the choice between the devil and the deep sea. Either the developing countries should suffer and face debt and balance of payments problems and so on, inflation and so on, or they would have to face, if they adopt the structural adjustment program, and as they have been forced to adopt the structural adjustment program through the Washington Consensus, then it has implications in terms of budget cuts, in terms of privatization, and all of this has had adverse effect on very crucial areas such as unemployment, poverty, health, and the environment.